Bitter wind howled through the narrow valley, carrying a silent, invisible killer. One man, trapped and completely out of options, made a desperate, bizarre choice, smearing hundreds of pounds of wet pottery clay over his shattered windows. Everyone thought he was doomed. Nobody knew a freak meteorological anomaly would become his only salvation. Arthur Gable did not consider himself a survivor. He was a 52-year-old ceramicist, living a quiet, solitary life in a restored 1930s logging cabin at the bottom of Blackwood Gorge, Washington. His days were measured in ounces of water, the rotation of his potter's wheel, and the firing schedules of his electric kiln. The cabin was rustic, charming, and terribly insulated. Its original single-pane sash windows rattled in their frames whenever the Pacific Northwest winds funneled down the steep valley walls. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when the mundane rhythm of Arthur's life was violently fractured. At 9:14 p.m., a deafening screech echoed through the gorge, a sound of tearing metal that vibrated the coffee mug right off Arthur's kitchen table. It wasn't a thunderclap. It was the catastrophic derailment of a massive freight train on the elevated tracks 3 miles upwind. The train, a 70-car behemoth operated by a regional logistics firm, had been navigating the treacherous Bendigo Curve when a compromised axle sent 14 cars plummeting off the rails and into the shallow riverbed below. Arthur stepped out onto his wooden porch, the frigid air biting through his flannel shirt. He expected to see flames, but there was no fire. Instead, under the pale moonlight, he saw a dense, sickly yellow-green fog billowing from the wreckage site, moving lazily but deliberately down the slope of the gorge. It hugged the ground, moving like a living, breathing entity. His phone buzzed violently in his pocket. It was an emergency broadcast alert, the shrill tone piercing the quiet night. Emergency alert. Toxic chemical release in Blackwood Gorge. Anhydrous ammonia and volatile solvents discharged. Do not evacuate on foot. Shelter in place. Seal all doors and windows. Immediately. Extreme respiratory hazard. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He rushed back inside and grabbed his landline phone, dialing his nearest neighbor, a retired structural engineer named Richard Abernathy, who lived half a mile closer to the highway. "Richard, did you get the alert?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling. "Arthur, listen to me." Richard coughed, a harsh, wet sound. "I tried to drive out. The lower bridge over Miller's Creek collapsed from the flash flood this afternoon. The gorge is a dead end. We're boxed in." "What is that stuff out there?" "It's a heavy gas mixture," Richard wheezed, panic bleeding into his usually stoic voice. "It's heavier than air. It's settling into the bottom of the valley." "My eyes are burning, Arthur. I taped my windows, but my house is old. It's getting in. Whatever you do, seal your house. Tape, plastic, whatever you have. Do it now." The line went dead. Arthur dropped the receiver. His cabin sat at the absolute lowest point of the gorge. If the gas was heavy, his property would become the ultimate catch basin for the toxic cloud. He sprinted to his utility closet, tearing through cardboard boxes until he found 2 rolls of silver duct tape and a box of heavy-duty black trash bags. He started in the living room, unrolling the bags and slapping tape over the edges of the wooden window frames. But the cabin was cold, and condensation had already formed on the inside of the single-pane glass. The adhesive on the duct tape slipped off the damp wood. Arthur wiped the frames furiously with a towel, trying to create a dry surface, but the moisture returned almost instantly. Outside, the wind began to pick up, shifting from a mild breeze to a sustained gale. The old wooden cabin groaned, the walls shifting just enough to break the fragile seals Arthur was trying to create. As he moved to the kitchen window, he caught a whiff of it, an acrid, sharp odor that smelled like industrial bleach mixed with rotting fish. The moment the scent hit his nostrils, his airway seized. A violent, involuntary cough tore through his throat. His eyes immediately began to water, stinging as if someone had thrown sand into them. The gas was already infiltrating the cabin through the microcracks in the floorboards and the gaps around the ancient windows. Arthur stumbled backward, covering his mouth with the collar of his shirt. He needed something better than tape. He needed an airtight seal. He looked around his home in desperation. Towels? They were porous. Foam insulation? He had used his last can 6 months ago to fix a draft in the attic. Then, a sudden, violent crash from the back of the house sent a jolt of pure terror down his spine. He ran toward his pottery studio, an attached sunroom on the north side of the cabin. A heavy dead branch from the towering Douglas fir outside had snapped in the rising wind and smashed directly through the center of the largest window. Jagged shards of glass littered the concrete floor, and pouring through the 3-foot-wide gaping hole was a thick, viscous stream of the yellow-green chemical fog. Arthur collapsed to his knees as a concentrated dose of the ammonia mixture hit his face. It felt as though he had inhaled a swarm of wasps. His lungs burned with a searing, agonizing heat, and his vision blurred into a watery kaleidoscope. He crawled backward, desperately dragging himself out of the studio and slamming the interior door shut. But the interior door was just a hollow-core wooden slab with a half-inch gap at the bottom. Within seconds, the yellow haze began to creep under the doorframe, spilling into the hallway like a sinister liquid. He was out of time. If he didn't plug that broken window, the concentration of the gas in the cabin would reach lethal levels in less than 10 minutes. Tape and plastic bags were entirely useless against a 3-foot breach with gale-force winds pushing a toxic cloud through it. He needed mass. He needed a barricade. Arthur ripped a heavy wool blanket off his bed, soaked it in the bathtub, and shoved it against the bottom of the studio door to buy himself a few minutes. He tied a wet bandana tightly over his nose and mouth, a futile gesture against industrial chemicals, but it was all he had. He pushed the studio door open. The room was a nightmare. The chemical fog was so thick, he could barely see the opposite wall. The wind howled through the broken pane, knocking over his tools and sending ceramic dust swirling into the toxic mix. His eyes landed on the corner of the room. Stacked on heavy wooden pallets were 40 boxes of Laguna B-Mix stoneware clay. Each box weighed 50 pounds, containing 2 tightly wrapped 25-pound blocks of dense, wet, pliable earth. Arthur's mind raced. Clay was impermeable. When packed tightly, it formed a completely airtight barrier. It was heavy enough to withstand the wind pressure, and it could be molded perfectly into the jagged edges of the broken glass in the wooden frame. Ignoring the burning in his chest, Arthur lunged for the pallets. He grabbed a box, his muscles screaming as he hauled the 50-pound weight to the work table beneath the shattered window. He tore open the cardboard, slicing through the heavy plastic casing with his pottery wire. Inside was a massive gray rectangle of wet earth. Arthur didn't bother cutting it into manageable pieces. Fueled by pure adrenaline and the primal terror of suffocation, he lifted the entire 25-pound block and slammed it directly into the bottom corner of the broken window frame. He drove his fists into the dense material, forcing it to spread, pushing the wet earth over the jagged shards of glass that still clung to the edges. The clay gripped the wood. It blocked the bottom quadrant of the hole instantly. He grabbed the second block and slammed it next to the first, mashing the seams together until they formed a continuous, thick wall of mud. The wind howled, pushing against the outside of the clay, but the sheer mass of the earth held its ground. Arthur worked like a madman. He dragged box after box across the studio floor, tearing them open and building a wall of wet clay, brick by brick, block by block, right up the middle of the window frame. He jammed handfuls of the gray mud into the smaller cracks, sealing the drafty edges of the sash, plugging the invisible leaks that duct tape had failed to secure. For 10 agonizing minutes, Arthur wrestled with the earth. His hands were covered in a thick, gray slurry. His lungs wheezed, rattling with every breath, and blood vessels in his eyes had ruptured, giving his vision a terrifying red tint. Finally, he lifted the last slab and shoved it into the top gap. He smoothed the entire surface with his forearms, creating a solid, 3-inch thick barricade of raw clay covering the entire window. The howling wind inside the studio stopped. The influx of the yellow gas ceased. Arthur staggered backward, collapsing against his potter's wheel, gasping for relatively cleaner air. The wet bandana over his face was stained with mucus and a trace of blood. He stared at the window. He had done it. He had sealed the breach, but his relief was painfully short-lived. Stoneware clay is heavy. A wall of it, measuring 3 feet by 3 feet and several inches thick, weighs hundreds of pounds, and wet clay has no structural integrity of its own when suspended in mid-air. It requires an armature, a skeleton, to hold its weight. Arthur had built this wall with nothing but the friction of the wooden frame and the jagged edges of the broken glass to support it. As Arthur watched, his heart sinking into his stomach, the center of the clay barricade began to bulge inward. The heat inside the cabin, combined with the sheer, immense weight of the wet earth, was causing the clay to slump. Gravity was pulling the massive gray belly of the barricade downward. A sickening schlick sound echoed in the quiet studio as the top edge of the clay wall began to pull away from the wooden frame. A jagged, dark fissure appeared at the top. Instantly, the wind outside screamed through the new crack, injecting a fresh, violent jet of yellow chemical fog straight into Arthur's face. "No," Arthur croaked, his voice a raspy whisper. "No, no, no." He scrambled to his feet and rushed the window, pressing both of his bare hands against the bulging center of the clay wall, trying to push it back into place. The mud was cold and slick. He shoved the top edge back against the wood, smearing it forcefully to close the fissure. But as soon as he removed his hands, the massive weight slumped again. The crack reopened, wider this time. Another jet of toxic air blasted in. He pressed his shoulders, his chest, his entire body against the wet clay, using his own physical weight as an armature. He could feel the relentless push of the wind from the outside, battling against his exhausted muscles. The clay was too wet, too heavy. It was stretching, thinning out in the middle like a piece of over-kneaded dough. He couldn't stand there forever. The gas was already filling the room again, leaking through smaller fissures that were webbing across the surface of the slumping wall. His strength was fading rapidly. His arms trembled uncontrollably, and dark spots danced in his peripheral vision. Oxygen deprivation and chemical inhalation were shutting his body down. Arthur Gable was losing the fight. He pressed his face against the cold, wet mud, tears mixing with the toxic residue on his cheeks. He realized, with a profound and quiet despair, that he was going to die here, pinned against a collapsing wall of his own making, suffocating in the dark. The clay slipped another inch, the top gap widening to nearly a full inch. The toxic wind roared in triumph. Arthur closed his eyes, his muscles giving out, preparing for the barricade to collapse completely and flood the room with the deadly tide. And then, the temperature dropped. The drop in temperature was not a gradual evening chill. It was a violent atmospheric hammer blow. Meteorologists in Seattle would later identify the phenomenon as a freak manifestation of the Fraser outflow, a sudden, high-pressure jet of trapped Arctic air from the Canadian interior that broke through the Cascade Mountains. The massive derailment of the Omni Logistics Corp freight train had coincided with the exact minute this localized, high-velocity atmospheric river slammed into Blackwood Gorge. Within the span of 12 minutes, the ambient temperature in the valley plummeted from a humid 48 degrees Fahrenheit to a bone-snapping 14 degrees. Arthur felt it before he understood it. Pinned against the collapsing wall of mud, his soaked flannel shirt suddenly turned rigid. The water that had condensed on the shattered window pane crystallized instantly, forming intricate jagged webs of frost across the remaining shards of glass. But the miracle was happening beneath Arthur's desperately pressing hand. Laguna B-mix clay is composed of nearly 30% water by weight. As the Arctic air blasted against the outside of the exposed mud barrier, that water began to rapidly change state. Arthur felt an unnatural stiffness radiating from the center of the bulge. The wet, slick surface beneath his palms lost its greasy texture, taking on the rough, unyielding grit of frozen stone. The sickening, slow-motion slump of the heavy earth ground to a halt. Arthur watched in stunned, breathless disbelief as the jagged, dark fissure at the top of the wooden frame stopped expanding. The freezing process was acting like a vice. As the water inside the clay turned to ice, it expanded slightly, forcing the dense particles of earth outward. The expanding frost wedged the clay tighter into the wooden frame, forcefully filling the microscopic gaps, locking onto the splintered wood and broken glass with the grip of solid concrete. The relentless jet of yellow chemical fog whistling through the top crack abruptly choked, then stopped entirely. The wall was frozen solid. The slump was suspended in midair, a bizarre, bulging sculpture of earth transformed into a load-bearing, impenetrable barrier of permafrost. Arthur peeled his hands away from the frozen mud, leaving bloody, skin-torn handprints behind on the icy surface. The wall held. He backed away, his legs giving out entirely as he hit the concrete floor of the studio. His lungs were burning with a hot, coppery agony. The air in the studio was heavily contaminated from the initial breach, an invisible soup of anhydrous ammonia and industrial solvents. Arthur's vision was narrowing to a pinprick, the edges of his sight turning black. His nervous system was beginning to shut down from the chemical asphyxiation. He knew he could not stay in the studio. Dragging himself on his elbows, Arthur crawled across the floor, his fingernails scraping against the concrete. Every inch was a battle against his own fading consciousness. He reached the hollow-core interior door, grabbed the brass handle, and pulled himself over the threshold into the narrow hallway of the cabin. He kicked the wet wool blanket back against the bottom of the door, rolled onto his back, and stared up at the wooden ceiling beams. The air in the hallway was bad, but it wasn't the concentrated death trap of the studio. It was breathable, barely. Arthur's chest heaved. A wet, rattling cough tore from his throat, speckling his pale lips with red foam. His eyes fluttered, the paralyzing cold of the cabin finally overwhelming his exhausted, poisoned body. As the darkness claimed him, his last conscious thought was the distant, muffled sound of his own pulse, fading into the howling of the Arctic wind. 3 miles up the gorge, the situation had descended into absolute chaos. At the incident command post, set up hastily at the edge of Highway 202, flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding pine trees in frantic strobe. Battalion Chief Thomas Reed, of the Regional Hazardous Materials Unit, stood inside a mobile command vehicle, staring grimly at a topographical map of Blackwood Gorge displayed on a glowing monitor. Wind speeds are holding at 40 miles per hour, a technician reported, his voice tight. The thermal inversion is capping the valley. The gas has nowhere to go but down. It's settling into the lower basin. Chief Reed dragged a heavy hand down his face. Toxicity levels at the crash site? Sensors are maxing out at over 3,000 parts per million of ammonia, plus whatever proprietary solvent Omni Logistics had in those secondary tanker cars. It's a lethal zone. What about the lower basin? Reed asked, pointing to a small, isolated square at the very bottom of the topographical map. It was Arthur Gable's property. The plume modeled a direct hit, the technician replied softly, with the lower bridge washed out and the chemical density settling at the bottom. Sir, the concentration down there would be entirely unsurvivable within 10 minutes of exposure. Without level A protective suits and self-contained breathing apparatuses, a human being's respiratory tract would be liquefied. Reed sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. He keyed his radio. Command to all perimeter units. Do not attempt entry into the lower gorge. I repeat, hold your lines. It's a recovery operation down there now. Nobody could survive that exposure. We wait for the sun, and we wait for the wind to scatter it. For the rest of the night, Blackwood Gorge was surrendered to the toxic fog and the biting frost. The heavy yellow cloud churned in the moonlight, a silent, deadly ocean filling the valley floor, completely submerging the small, restored logging cabin at the bottom. The sun breached the Cascade Mountains at 6:45 a.m., casting long, sharp shadows across the frostbitten landscape. The intense Arctic wind that had terrorized the valley overnight finally broke, giving way to a still, terrifying silence. As the morning sun warmed the upper ridges, the thermal inversion snapped. The heavy blanket of cold air lifted, taking the worst of the toxic yellow fog up and out of the gorge, dispersing it into the upper atmosphere. By 8:30 a.m., the toxicity sensors at the command post showed a massive drop in parts per million. It was still highly dangerous, but it was no longer an immediate death sentence for protected personnel. Hazmat Team 4, you are cleared to advance. Chief Reed ordered over the radio. Proceed down the logging road to the residential marker. Expect a localized recovery scenario. Proceed with extreme caution. A heavily modified tactical vehicle, its tires crunching over the frost-covered gravel, crawled down the steep winding path into the lower gorge. Inside, 4 men encased in bulky, bright green Level A encapsulating suits sat in grim silence. They were fully sealed from the outside world, breathing through independent air tanks strapped to their backs. Lieutenant Gregory Miller, the team leader, stared through the thick polycarbonate visor of his suit as the cabin came into view. It looked picturesque, like a postcard of winter solitude, except for the lingering, pale yellow haze clinging to the dead grass around the foundation. The team dismounted, moving with the slow, deliberate steps required by their cumbersome suits. They approached the front porch, carrying heavy breaching tools and handheld chemical detectors. PID sensors are reading 200 ppm at the door. A team member named Jenkins reported over the comms. "It's bad, but it's residual." The main cloud passed through. Lieutenant Miller stepped up to the front door. "Police! Hazmat! Anyone inside?" he bellowed, though he knew his voice was muffled by the thick rubber of his suit. Silence. Miller nodded to his breacher. A heavy steel ram struck the door just above the lock. The old wood splintered instantly, and the door swung inward. The team entered, their helmet lights cutting through the gloom of the cabin. The interior was freezing, the air heavy with the stench of ammonia. Frost coated the walls and the furniture, sweeping the living room. "Clear," a voice crackled over the radio. "Kitchen is clear." Miller moved down the narrow hallway, his boots crunching on something hard. He looked down and saw a soaking wet, partially frozen wool blanket shoved against the bottom of a hollow core door. Beyond the blanket, lying motionless on the frost-covered floorboards, was Arthur Gable. Miller dropped to his knees, his thick, rubber gloves fumbling clumsily as he reached for Arthur's neck. The man's skin was ice cold, his face pale and stained with dried blood from his nose and mouth. "I've got a victim," Miller called out. Wait. Stand by." Miller pressed his gloved fingers harder against Arthur's carotid artery. It was faint, terrifyingly faint, fluttering like a dying moth, but it was there. "He's got a pulse. We have a live victim. Requesting immediate medevac at the extraction point." "Push the ETA," Miller shouted, carefully rolling Arthur onto his side to keep his compromised airway open. "Bring the portable oxygen, now." As two team members rushed to stabilize Arthur, placing a specialized sealed mask over his face, Miller stood up and looked at the door the victim had been guarding. He stepped over the frozen blanket and pushed the handle. The door swung open into the pottery studio. Miller stepped inside and froze. His chemical detector began to scream, the numbers spiking violently. The air in this specific room was still highly lethal. But it wasn't the detector that stopped the seasoned hazmat lieutenant in his tracks. It was the window. Miller's helmet light illuminated the shattered wooden frame. Protruding from it, bulging inward like a pregnant gray belly, was a massive, solid block of earth. It was heavily frosted, glowing white in the flashlight beam, completely sealing a 3-foot hole where the glass should have been. It looked like an architectural impossibility, a heavy mass suspended entirely by friction and ice. Miller stepped closer, entirely baffled. He reached out and tapped the gray surface with his heavy knuckles. It sounded like striking solid concrete. He traced the edges where the frozen mud had expanded, biting into the splintered wood and creating a perfect, airtight gasket against the deadly atmosphere outside. He looked down at the empty, torn cardboard boxes of Laguna clay scattered across the floor, and then back to the frozen barricade. The realization of what the man in the hallway had done hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Command, this is Miller," he radioed, his voice laced with absolute awe. "You are not going to believe what we are looking at down here." 3 days later, Arthur Gable opened his eyes. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit at St. Jude Medical Center were blinding. A steady, rhythmic beeping filled the room, and a thick, plastic oxygen mask covered his face. His throat felt as if he had swallowed ground glass, and his chest ached with a deep, bruised heaviness. A man in a white coat, Dr. Harrison Cole, stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing a chart. When he saw Arthur's eyes open, he smiled a tight, professional smile that betrayed genuine relief. "Welcome back to the world, Mr. Gable," Dr. Cole said softly, stepping to the side of the bed. "Don't try to speak. Your vocal cords and your upper respiratory tract took severe chemical burns from the ammonia exposure. You've been in a medically induced coma for 72 hours to allow your lungs to heal." Arthur blinked slowly, his mind struggling to piece together the fractured memories of the dark, the burning air, and the crushing weight of the wet earth. "You are incredibly lucky to be alive, Doctor," Cole continued, adjusting an IV line. "The hazmat team commander visited yesterday. He brought photos of your architectural handiwork. Dr. Cole pulled a tablet from his pocket and held it up. On the screen was a high-resolution photo taken by Lieutenant Miller. It showed the massive, frozen bulge of clay, perfectly sealing the shattered window frame, a testament to raw desperation and impossible physics. The structural engineers who analyzed the scene were baffled, the doctor explained, his tone shifting into quiet amazement. They calculated the weight of the clay you used versus the friction of the window frame. Under normal circumstances, that mud wall would have collapsed under its own weight in less than 5 minutes. Arthur stared at the photo, his heart rate ticking up slightly on the monitor. He remembered the sickening slip of the clay, the toxic jet of gas hitting his face, the absolute certainty that he had failed. But you see, Dr. Cole leaned in slightly. The emergency responders didn't understand how it held until the meteorologists released their timeline of the storm. The exact moment the wall began to fail, the Fraser outflow hit your valley. The ambient temperature dropped below freezing so fast that the water inside your pottery clay crystallized almost instantly. Dr. Cole paused, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. The cold expanded the ice, tightening the seal. It flash-froze the mud into a solid, load-bearing structure. If that temperature drop had happened even 60 seconds later, Dr. Cole shook his head slowly. The wall would have collapsed. You would have been exposed to a lethal dose of gas within moments. You saved your own life with that clay, Mr. Gable. But the frost. The frost gave you the final 60 seconds you needed. Arthur closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down his cheek, soaking into the white medical tape holding his oxygen tube in place. He had fought the earth. He had fought the air. And in the end, it was the bitter, biting cold, the very thing that usually destroys life, that had locked his salvation in place. Arthur Gable would never look at the winter frost the same way again. It was no longer just the harbinger of dead leaves and dark nights. It was the silent, freezing hand that had reached down in the absolute darkest moment of his life, held back the toxic tide, and given him back his tomorrow. The human will to survive is incredible, but sometimes nature steps in to tip the scales. Arthur Gable's terrifying ordeal reminds us that salvation can come from the most unexpected places. If this incredible true story of survival against the odds kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life dramas.